What if the pyramids were never meant to explain the past, but to survive it? What if they were already ancient when the first Egyptian kings stood beneath them, trying to understand what they had inherited? What if the most important clue isn't hidden in a lost text or sealed behind a door, but written into the stone itself in the way it remembers weather, time, and silence? Tonight, we won't claim answers. We won't rewrite history. Instead, we'll do something far more unsettling. We'll ask a question history rarely asks. What if the pyramids were not built at the beginning of civilization, but left behind after something ended? And what if they were designed to wait for those who would come later and learn how to listen? The official story is simple. According to history, the pyramids of Giza were built around 4,500 years ago during Egypt's fourth dynasty. They were raised as royal tombs, monuments to kings, designed to carry their names into eternity. It is a story taught in textbooks, repeated in museums, and spoken aloud every day beneath the desert sun. And for a long time, it seemed complete. But history is not only written by words, it is also written by stone, by patterns, by things that don't quite fit. Tonight, we won't try to tear this story down. Instead, we'll place it gently beside another possibility. Because what if the pyramids do belong to Egypt, but not to its beginning? What if Egypt inherited something far older, something already shaped by time, already marked by forces the dynasties never witnessed? To explore that question, we won't start with kings or inscriptions. We'll start in silence, at night, on the plateau itself. In the plateau after voices, a night settles over the Giza plateau. The heat of the day fades, and with it, the crowds. The tour buses roll away. Footsteps disappear into the dark. The desert exhales. What remains is not emptiness, but presence. Under the moonlight, the pyramids no longer feel like destinations. They feel like survivors. Their edges soften in the darkness. Their scale becomes harder to measure. Distance itself seems unreliable, as if the stones are closer than they should be, as if they are pressing inward on the space around them. This is when the plateau feels oldest. Without voices, without explanations, the monuments stop behaving like monuments. They become something quieter, something that does not need to announce itself. The Sphinx waits at the edge of the limestone escarpment, half buried, scarred, its body stretched forward, its gaze fixed east, toward the place where the sun has risen for thousands of years. Not toward the city, not toward the river, but toward a horizon that existed long before Egypt had a name. Standing here at night, one detail becomes impossible to ignore. The Sphinx does not sit on the plateau. It emerges from it. Its body is carved directly from the living bedrock, the same stone that forms the walls of the enclosure around it. This was not assembled, it was revealed. And the stone around it remembers how it was revealed. Run your eyes along the enclosure walls, down into the deep rectangular trench that cradles the monument. The limestone is not smooth, not sharp, not cut cleanly like the blocks of later temples nearby. Instead, it is rounded, grooved, shaped by something patient, something that flowed. This is not yet a conclusion, only an observation, because stone records history differently than texts do. It does not exaggerate. It does not revise. It does not forget. It keeps the memory of what touched it long after the names of builders are lost. And the first question begins to form. What if the stone is older than the story we tell about it? What if the plateau remembers a time before Egypt learned how to write its own history? To another water question. To understand what the stone is saying, we have to learn how to read it. Not as architecture, not as symbolism, but as geology. Water leaves a signature. When wind shapes stone, it scours it sideways. Edges sharpen, surfaces flatten, layers peel away in thin sheets. But when water moves across rock, especially rain falling again and again over long periods of time, it carves differently. It cuts downward. It rounds edges. It leaves vertical channels, soft curves, patterns that look less like cuts and more like frozen motion. Inside the Sphinx enclosure, those patterns appear. They run along the walls that surround the monument, deep grooves that descend from top to bottom, as if something once flowed there long before sand became the dominant force of the plateau. This observation has led to questions that refuse to disappear, because the Giza Plateau has not known sustained rainfall for a very long time. The climate record is clear. There was a time near the end of the last ice age when North Africa was green, when seasonal rains fed rivers and lakes, when grasslands stretched across regions that are now silent desert. And then gradually the rains retreated, the Sahara dried, the landscape changed. By the time Egypt's dynasties rose along the Nile, the plateau was already arid, already shaped by wind, not water. So the question is not dramatic, it is precise. What if part of the Sphinx was exposed during a wetter chapter of Earth's history? What if the stone remembers rain that fell before the desert existed in its current form? This does not require us to reject Egypt. It does not demand a lost super-civilization. It only asks us to consider a possibility that the Sphinx may have been shaped, at least in part, during a climate Egypt never knew. If that were true, the implications would be quiet but profound. It would mean that when the earliest Egyptians stood here, they did not see a newly carved monument. They saw something already weathered, already marked by time, already carrying a past they did not witness, not built for them, but encountered by them. And suddenly the word restoration begins to feel heavier than construction, because restoration implies inheritance. It implies a past worth preserving, even if its origin is no longer understood. The stone does not accuse, it does not insist, it simply waits. And the water it remembers continues to ask the same question, again and again. What if the monument was already old when Egypt was young? The silence inside. If the exterior of the plateau raises questions, the interior of the Great Pyramid deepens them. Step away from the moonlit sand, leave the open horizon behind, and descend. The entrance is narrow, low, and unwelcoming. You bend forward, your shoulders draw inward. The outside world falls away with every step. The air grows cooler. The sound changes. Stone absorbs noise. Inside the pyramid, silence is not emptiness. It feels intentional. The passage slopes downward, then rises again, guiding you through angles that feel calculated rather than symbolic. There is no decoration to distract the eye, no inscriptions to explain where you are or why, and that absence is unusual. Egyptian tombs speak constantly. They are filled with names, prayers, spells, walls covered in texts meant to guide the dead through the afterlife. Every surface tells a story, but here, inside the largest monument Egypt ever claimed, there are no stories written on the walls, no hieroglyphs, no gods, no declarations of kingship, only geometry. The passages align with remarkable precision. Angles repeat. Distances feel measured, not improvised. Then the space opens. The Grand Gallery rises suddenly, its corbelled walls stepping inward as they climb. Stone laid upon stone with a precision that feels almost excessive. Each block leans slightly, as if the structure is both holding itself up and channeling something upward. Sound behaves strangely here. Even a whisper seems to linger longer than it should, echoing softly before dissolving into the stone. And at the top of the gallery lies the central chamber, a room built not from limestone, but from massive blocks of red granite. The stone is different here, denser, harder, filled with crystals that respond to pressure and vibration. The chamber is bare, no carvings, no color, no imagery of death or rebirth. At its center sits a massive granite box, often called a sarcophagus. But look closely. It has no lid, no inscriptions, no decoration. Its interior is rough, unfinished, unlike the carefully polished burial containers found elsewhere in Egypt. And its dimensions reveal something strange. The box is wider than the passages leading to the chamber. It could not have been carried in after construction. It must have been placed here before the structure was sealed around it. This is not how tombs are usually designed. Burial objects arrive at the end. They are not embedded at the beginning. Standing in this chamber, a thought forms quietly. What if this space was not meant to honor the dead, but to function, not as a shrine, not as a final resting place, but as a room built to do something? The pyramid does not feel unfinished. It feels restrained, as if it is waiting to be understood rather than entered. And the silence inside it begins to feel less like absence and more like patience. Near the door that doesn't need a human. Some of the strangest features of the Great Pyramid are not found in its largest chambers. They are hidden in places no human was ever meant to enter. From the Queen's Chamber, two narrow shafts extend upward into the body of the pyramid. They are small, just wide enough for air, or light, or something else entirely. For decades, they were described simply as symbolic, passages for the spirit, architectural curiosities. No one expected them to lead anywhere. But in the early 1990s, when technology finally allowed exploration beyond human reach, a small robotic device was sent into one of these shafts. It moved slowly, inch by inch, its camera pressed close to the stone. Smooth walls, sharp angles, carefully cut surfaces, and then deep inside the pyramid, the robot stopped. Blocking its path was not rubble, not a collapse, but a door. A small limestone slab, fitted neatly into the shaft, sealed in place. Two copper fittings protruded from its surface, too symmetrical to be accidental. This was not erosion. This was not damage. It was design. The door was carefully placed in a passage no human could ever crawl through, which raises a simple question. If no one was meant to enter, why build a door at all? Years later, when a tiny opening was finally made, a camera slipped through the stone. On the other side, only a short distance away, stood another barrier, a second sealed surface, another deliberate ending. The shaft did not open into a chamber. It did not reveal a treasure. It revealed restraint. This is not the behavior of a tomb. Tombs are meant to be accessed, used, completed. But these shafts were sealed from within the structure itself, hidden behind layers of stone, untouched for millennia. It feels less like something meant to be opened quickly and more like something meant to wait, a message not written for the present, perhaps not even written for Egypt. And the deeper question quietly takes shape. What if these passages were not designed for people, but for time? What if the builders were not trying to keep something out, but to protect something until a future moment of understanding? The pyramid does not rush. It does not explain itself. It places a boundary and then waits to see who will learn how to cross it. But inheritors, not builders. History often imagines civilizations as creators. We picture beginnings, foundations laid from nothing, first stones placed where there was only sand. But human history rarely works that way. More often, civilizations inherit. They arrive in landscapes already shaped by others. They find ruins whose purposes are no longer clear. They restore, repurpose, and reinterpret what survived before them. This is not deception, it is continuity. Across the ancient world, this pattern repeats. New cultures settle near old structures. They repair walls they did not originally raise. They assign new meanings to forms whose original language is lost. Over time, inheritance becomes identity. The object remains, the story changes. When we look at Egypt through this lens, a different possibility begins to form. What if the pyramids and the sphinx were not sudden inventions, but encounters? What if the earliest Egyptians stood before these structures with the same mixture of awe and uncertainty we feel today? They would have seen monuments already weathered, already monumental, already difficult to explain. What would they have done? They would have restored them, integrated them into their cosmology, aligned them with their gods, their kings, their afterlife beliefs, not as imposters, but as caretakers. In this view, Egypt does not lose anything. Its genius shifts from invention to interpretation. The pyramids become anchors, fixed points around which a new civilization organized meaning. This would explain something subtle but important. Why Egypt left so few direct accounts of how these monuments were first conceived. Egyptian records are meticulous. They celebrate construction projects in detail. Temples, statues, canals, all carefully documented. And yet the greatest structures of all remain strangely quiet in their earliest chapters. Not denied, not explained, simply absorbed. What if that silence is not absence, but acknowledgement, an understanding that these monuments belong to a deeper past, one Egypt chose to preserve rather than erase? And if that is true, then the pyramids are not anomalies in Egyptian history. They are inheritances from a memory older than Egypt itself. And inheritance carries responsibility, because once something is inherited, it must be maintained, protected, and explained, even if its origin can no longer be recalled. The stones remain patient. They do not insist on credit. They do not demand recognition. They simply endure, waiting for each new culture, each new generation, to decide how much of the past it is willing to remember. With a pattern beyond Egypt. If Giza were the only place where history felt out of alignment, it would be easy to dismiss the questions. An exception, an anomaly, a misunderstanding magnified by mystery. But Giza is not alone. When we step back far enough, a pattern begins to emerge. Quiet, global, and deeply uncomfortable. Across the world, there are structures that appear far too early, too precise, too monumental for the cultures officially credited with them. They rise in places separated by oceans, built from different stone, spoken of in different myths. Yet they share the same signatures. Massive blocks moved with improbable efficiency, precision cutting beyond the limits of simple tools. Astronomical alignments that require long-term observation. And most telling of all, a silence about who truly began them. In southeastern Turkey, a hilltop once dismissed as natural revealed carved stone pillars over 12,000 years old. Not crude, not experimental, but deliberate, symbolic, and monumental. In Lebanon, stones weighing hundreds of tons were placed with tolerances so exact that even modern cranes struggle to explain them. In the Andes, stone blocks interlock like engineered components, their angles precise, their surfaces unnaturally flat, as if cut to a standard no one remembers. In Malta, chambers carved underground resonate at frequencies that affect the human nervous system, designed not just to exist, but to do something. These sites were not built in isolation. They appear in the same deep window of time, near the end of the last ice age, as climates shifted violently, as coastlines drowned, as entire regions transformed. And then they stop. The tradition does not evolve. It does not improve. It disappears. Later cultures arrive. They reuse the sites. They mythologize them. They build nearby, but never quite the same way again. Just like Egypt, the same question follows every structure. If these monuments were created by early humans, just learning to organize themselves, why do they never repeat this level of achievement? Why does history move backward from perfection instead of forward toward it? Unless what we are seeing is not the rise of civilization, but its echo, fragments left behind after something larger collapsed, a memory distributed across continents, preserved in stone because stone outlasts language. And if that is true, then Egypt was not alone in inheritance. It was part of a wider remembering, one that stretched far beyond the Nile, far beyond dynasties, far beyond what history is comfortable admitting. Because once the pattern is seen, it cannot be unseen. And the question changes, not who built the pyramids, but what kind of world existed that built all of this and then vanished? Or to the world before memory. What if the problem isn't that we've misunderstood the past? What if the problem is that the past we're looking for no longer exists in a form we recognize? History depends on memory, and memory depends on survival. But what happens when an entire world does not survive? When coastlines disappear beneath rising seas? When fertile plains turn to desert? When cities built near rivers and shores are erased not by war, but by water and time? At the end of the last ice age, the Earth changed rapidly. Glaciers melted. Sea levels rose more than 400 feet. Regions that had been inhabited for thousands of years were swallowed. If a culture had flourished along those ancient coastlines, if it had built with stone, tracked the sky, understood mathematics and cycles, what would remain? Not their houses, not their tools, not their words. Only what was deliberately made to endure: stone monuments, astronomical alignments, geometry carved into landscapes. Everything else would vanish. And the survivors? They would scatter. Some would move inland. Some would merge with other peoples. Some would forget. But forgetting would not happen all at once. It would take generations. Stories would turn into myths, knowledge into symbols, teachers into gods, and eventually only fragments would remain. Not enough to reconstruct the world that was, but enough to feel that something is missing. This may explain why ancient civilizations across the globe speak of a time before time, a golden age, an age of gods, an age before the flood. Not as poetry, but as memory struggling to survive translation. What if these stories are not fantasies at all? What if they are distorted recollections of a real world that existed before history began keeping score? In this view, the pyramids are not achievements of a beginning. They are messages from an ending, built not to celebrate power, but to preserve knowledge, not meant to explain themselves to their builders' children, but to strangers who would one day rise from the ruins, strangers like us. And if that is true, then the pyramids were never meant to be understood quickly. They were meant to be rediscovered slowly. Only when humanity reached a point where it could once again measure the earth, track the stars, and recognize the language of mathematics, only then would the message become visible, and perhaps that moment is now. Why stone was chosen. In what if the builders of the pyramids understood something we are only beginning to remember? That knowledge is fragile. Words fade, languages change, libraries burn, even memory itself dissolves across generations. But stone endures. Stone survives floods. Stone survives fire. Stone survives the collapse of nations and the silence that follows. If a civilization knew it was facing catastrophe, not invasion, not political collapse, but environmental erasure, how would it preserve what mattered most? Not names, not rulers, not myths. Those are temporary. It would preserve principles, ratios, cycles, measurements, things that do not belong to any culture, any language, any belief system. Mathematics does not need translation. Astronomy does not need mythology. A circle is always a circle. North is always north. The Earth's dimensions do not change because a civilization forgets them. What if the pyramid was designed as a container for this kind of knowledge? Not written, not spoken, embedded. Its alignment to true north, more precise than most modern buildings. Its proportions encoding relationships between height, perimeter, and the planet itself. Its chambers positioned not randomly, but according to geometric and acoustic logic. Nothing decorative, nothing personal, no kings, no gods, only structure, only intention. In that light, the absence of hieroglyphs is not mysterious. It is necessary. Writing ties knowledge to a time, a culture, a worldview. Stone geometry does not. The pyramid does not say who built it. It says what was known. And it says it in a way that only a civilization capable of rediscovering that knowledge could ever understand. Perhaps the builders knew that those who came next would not remember them, but they hoped they would eventually remember themselves, that they would reach a moment when they could look at stone and recognize the language hidden inside it, not as faith, not as legend, but as comprehension. And so the pyramid waited, through dynasties, through empires, through conquest and neglect, waiting not for worship, but for recognition, waiting for a mind capable of asking the right question. What if this was never meant to be a tomb at all? Hear the silence inside. Step inside the Great Pyramid. Leave the desert behind. Leave the sky. Leave the horizon. The entrance narrows. The light fades. Stone closes in from every side. And then silence. Not the silence of abandonment, not the silence of decay, a deliberate silence. There are no names here, no prayers carved into the walls, no stories told in paint or relief, no instructions for the dead. Every other royal tomb in Egypt speaks constantly, walls covered in spells, passages lined with images, words meant to guide a soul through the afterlife. Here there is nothing, only stone, only geometry, only space. What if this silence is not absence? What if it is restraint? The chambers feel measured, not empty. Their proportions precise, their angles intentional. The grand gallery rises like a frozen wave, its walls stepping inward with mathematical discipline. Each stone placed to distribute weight, to guide force, to shape space. The king's chamber waits at the end, red granite, harder than limestone, filled with quartz, a material that responds to pressure, to vibration, to sound. And in the center, a stone box, not decorated, not sealed, not marked. It does not feel like a container for a body. It feels like a component. Nothing here behaves like a tomb. There is no reverence for death, no fear of decay. Instead, there is control, control of weight, control of resonance, control of alignment. Sound behaves differently here. The chamber answers when disturbed. A low tone does not disappear. It lingers, folds back on itself, travels through stone. What if this place was built to interact with vibration, with frequency, with forces that cannot be seen but can be felt? And then there are the shafts, narrow, unreachable, angled with purpose. They do not ventilate. They do not allow passage. They point towards stars that no longer sit where they once did, stars that marked the sky thousands of years ago. Why would a tomb need that? Why would the dead require orientation to celestial coordinates? Unless the structure was never about death at all. Unless it was about connection between earth and sky, between stone and cycle, between memory and time. The pyramid does not explain itself. It does not instruct. It waits. And in that waiting, another question forms. What if the builders believed that understanding should not be given freely? That knowledge should reveal itself only when the observer is ready? The silence inside the pyramid is not emptiness. It is patience. Oh, the doors that should not exist. For centuries, it was believed that the Great Pyramid had revealed all it contained. 3 chambers, a handful of passages, nothing more. That belief ended quietly, not with an explosion, not with a discovery made by hand, but with a machine. In the early 1990s, a small robotic device was sent into one of the narrow shafts leading out from the Queen's chamber. These shafts were long dismissed as symbolic. Soul passages, some called them, routes for a spirit, not for people. But symbols do not need doors. The robot moves slowly, its camera transmitting images from a place no human body could reach. Smooth limestone, sharp angles, careful construction, and then it stopped. Blocking the shaft was a perfectly cut limestone door, set flush, sealed, fitted with copper pins. Not debris, not collapse. A door, designed to be there. The shaft was too narrow for any human to enter, so the door was not built to keep intruders out. It was built to seal something in. Years passed. Eventually, permission was granted to drill a small hole through the door. A fiber optic camera slipped inside. On the other side was another door, closer than expected, equally precise, equally sealed. The exploration ended there. No explanation followed, no urgency, no continuation, just silence, and the doors remain. Why would a structure, supposedly a tomb, contain sealed passages that lead nowhere visible? Why build multiple barriers inside a space no one was meant to enter? And why stop precisely at the moment when something unexpected appears? Similar anomalies have appeared elsewhere. Radar scans revealing voids where no voids should exist. Subterranean chambers beneath the plateau. Spaces beneath the sphinx. Areas declared restricted. Each time the pattern repeats. Detection, interest, closure. It is tempting to imagine treasure, relics, sensational secrets. But perhaps the truth is quieter. Perhaps what is sealed is not something dangerous, but something fragile, something meant to remain untouched until the right moment. If the pyramid is a container for memory, then access matters. Timing matters. You do not open an archive before you understand the language it uses, and maybe the doors are not locked against us. Maybe they are waiting for us to ask better questions first. Just the pattern beyond Egypt. What if the pyramids are not alone? What if Giza is not an exception, but a node in a much older pattern? Across the world, far from the Nile, structures rise where they should not exist. Massive stones moved without obvious tools. Precision cuts where only rough work was expected. Alignments to the sky that require long observation and deep understanding. In southeastern Anatolia, stone circles were raised long before agriculture was supposed to exist. In the Andes, blocks interlock so perfectly that even a blade cannot pass between them. In Malta, underground chambers resonate at specific frequencies, their walls shaped to guide sound through stone. In Lebanon, foundation stones weigh hundreds of tons, set in place with a confidence that modern machines still struggle to match. Different continents, different cultures, different myths, and yet the same signatures. Stone chosen over wood, geometry over decoration, alignment over ornament. These places do not speak of kings. They do not glorify conquest. They speak of knowledge, of measurement, of cycles, of a shared understanding that transcends language. What if these structures were never meant to belong to the cultures that later claimed them? What if they were inherited, restored, reused, reinterpreted, like the pyramids? Perhaps long before written history, there existed a way of building that prioritized permanence over power, a way of preserving information not in text, but in form, not in stories, but in structure. And when those builders vanished, through climate change, through rising seas, through catastrophe, we no longer remember. Their works remained, silent, patient, waiting. In what remains, night deepens. The stars return to their places above the plateau, the same stars the ancient shafts once pointed toward. The pyramids stand unmoved. They have watched deserts form. They have watched kingdoms rise and fall. They have watched names be forgotten, and still they remain. Perhaps that was always the point. Not to be understood immediately, not to impress, not to dominate, but to endure. If the pyramids were built by a forgotten civilization, then they are not relics of arrogance. They are acts of humility, an acknowledgement that no civilization lasts forever. That memory is fragile. That knowledge once lost is painfully slow to recover. So it was placed in stone, encoded in proportions, aligned with the earth, anchored to the sky, a message without words, not saying who we were, but what we knew. And maybe the message is not about the past at all. Maybe it is about us, about what we choose to preserve, about how we measure progress, about whether we believe that our own world is permanent. The pyramids do not warn, they remind that civilizations can forget, that worlds can end, that knowledge can survive, if we choose to carry it forward. The desert wind moves softly across the plateau. The stones cool under the night sky. Nothing more needs to be said. The pyramids have already spoken. Sleep now. Let the questions rest. Let the mind drift. The answers are not urgent. They have waited thousands of years. They can wait a little longer. In the inheritance question, so what if the most important question is not who built the pyramids, but who inherited them? Because inheritance changes everything. A builder leaves instructions, an inheritor leaves adaptations. And when you look closely at Giza, what you see does not behave like a project under construction. It behaves like something already complete, already old, already demanding interpretation. Think about how civilizations normally build. They start small, they experiment, they improve over time. Early structures are crude, later ones are refined, but Giza appears in reverse. The Great Pyramid arrives fully formed. Perfect alignment, extreme precision, no trial phase, no architectural ancestors leading up to it. And after it, everything gets smaller, less precise, more symbolic, more decorative. That is not the pattern of invention. It is the pattern of decline after mastery. So what if the Egyptians didn't begin monumental stone construction? What if they stepped into it? Imagine arriving at a landscape already marked by impossible structures, monuments that cannot be replicated, stones too large, alignments too precise, geometry too exact. You don't destroy them. You don't ignore them. You reinterpret them. You assign them meaning. You integrate them into your religion. You build temples nearby. You carve your king's names around them, not inside them. You become their custodians. This would explain something subtle but crucial. The Egyptians were obsessive record keepers. They documented harvests, wars, rituals, offerings, even dreams. Yet for the greatest structures on earth, they left no construction records, no blueprints, no step-by-step accounts, no inscriptions celebrating the act of building itself. Only restoration, only clearing sand, only honoring what already stood. That silence is not accidental. It suggests hesitation, as if the builders understood something about these structures, but did not fully control them. And that raises a quieter, more unsettling possibility. What if the pyramids were not designed for the Egyptians at all? What if they were designed to be found, not immediately understood, but recognized, like a message written in a language too advanced for its first readers, waiting patiently for a later mind to catch up? Because inheritance is not passive. Inheritance is a test. When you inherit something you cannot recreate, you face a choice: preserve it, reinterpret it, or slowly forget what it was meant to do. History suggests the Egyptians chose all three. They preserved the structures, they reinterpreted their meaning, and over generations, the original purpose faded. What remained was awe, and awe is powerful, but it is not understanding. So perhaps the pyramids were never meant to be explained by a single civilization. Perhaps they were meant to outlast many, built by one culture, inherited by another, questioned by us. And if that is true, then the pyramids are not a mystery of construction. They are a mystery of continuity, a reminder that knowledge does not always belong to those who possess the stones, only to those who eventually learn how to read them. And that brings us to a different kind of question. If the pyramids were inherited, what else was inherited along with them? Because monuments rarely stand alone. And what follows next is not found in stone, but in something far more fragile: memory. The fragile chain of memory. If the pyramids were inherited, then memory itself becomes the weakest link. Stone can survive floods, geometry can survive time, but memory depends on people, and people disappear. Civilizations do not usually collapse all at once. They thin out, they fragment, they forget small things first. A word loses its meaning, a ritual becomes symbolic instead of functional, a story turns into myth, and eventually no one remembers why something was built, only that it must have been important. This is how purpose dissolves without destruction. Look at how knowledge disappears even today. Hard drives fail, Formats become unreadable. Languages die within generations. Now imagine a culture facing catastrophe, climate collapse, flooding, displacement, extinction. What knowledge would survive? Not manuals, not instructions, not explanations, only fragments, only shapes, only alignments, only things too large to erase. If the pyramids came from such a moment, they were not meant to teach in the short term. They were meant to endure long enough for understanding to return. This reframes the silence inside the Great Pyramid. No inscriptions, no names, no stories carved into the walls. Not because the builders lack language, but because language fails across deep time. Words decay faster than stone, meaning faster than symbols. So instead of writing history, they embedded it. Instead of instructions, they left relationships between earth and sky, between dimension and number, between stone and horizon. A civilization inheriting such structures would sense their importance without grasping their origin. And that is exactly what we see. The Egyptians treated the pyramids as sacred, but not as comprehensible. They honored them, protected them, restored them, but they did not replicate them. And this is the most telling detail of all. A civilization capable of building something always builds it again, improves it, refines it, expands it. But no pyramid ever surpassed the Great Pyramid. No structure repeated its precision. No later monument matched its scale with the same intent. It stands alone, not as a beginning, but as a remnant, which leads to a difficult realization. If memory broke once, it can break again. If a culture advanced enough to encode planetary knowledge in stone could lose its own understanding, then progress is not guaranteed. It is borrowed. And every civilization lives on a thin thread of continuity, hoping it will not be the one where memory snaps. So the pyramids may not be asking, how were we built? They may be asking something quieter. What will you remember? And what will you forget? Because inheritance is not possession, inheritance is responsibility. And in the silence of stone, that responsibility has been waiting a very long time. The break in the line. There is a moment in every long history where continuity fails, not dramatically, not with fire or noise, but quietly. A generation passes without understanding what the previous one assumed was obvious. A tool is preserved, but the reason it worked is forgotten. A structure remains, but the knowledge that shaped it dissolves. And from that moment on, everything looks intact, yet nothing functions the same way. This is what a break in the line feels like. If the pyramids were inherited, then somewhere before dynastic Egypt, that break already happened. Not a total collapse, a thinning. Enough people survived to remember that the monuments mattered, but not enough to remember what they were for. So meaning narrowed. What was once technical became symbolic. What was once functional became sacred. What was once precise became mythic. This explains a strange contradiction. The Egyptians were master builders, yet they never attempted to unlock the pyramid. They never dismantled it, never modified its internal design, never forced entry into its sealed spaces. They approached it the way one approaches something dangerous or holy, with reverence and restraint, as if they sensed that interfering might destroy something they could not restore. And this is how knowledge truly dies. Not when structures fall, but when people decide it is safer not to ask. When curiosity gives way to ritual, when preservation replaces understanding, the break does not announce itself. It hides inside respect. And once that line is broken, Future generations inherit certainty without context. They repeat explanations because explanations feel better than silence. They call monuments tombs because tombs are familiar. They assign names because names reduce uncertainty. But these answers do not come from evidence. They come from the need to close the question. And once a story is closed, it stops being investigated. The pyramids may be the clearest example of this. A structure so precisely engineered that it could not have been accidental, yet explained in the simplest terms possible because complexity threatens comfort. If there was once a continuous chain of knowledge, it did not end with a collapse. It ended with an accommodation, a quiet agreement to stop asking what could not be answered. And that decision, more than any catastrophe, may be what erased the builders from memory. Because when the line breaks, the future does not know what it has lost. It only knows what remains. Stone without context, geometry without explanation, precision without purpose. And that is the moment when inheritance becomes confusion. When questions become dangerous. There is a stage in every long tradition when questions stop being curious and start being inconvenient. Not because they are false, but because they disturb what has already been accepted. Once an explanation settles into place, it becomes part of identity. To question it feels like dismantling more than a theory. It feels like threatening order. If the pyramids were inherited, then at some point asking what they truly were became less important than maintaining what they had come to represent. Kings ruled through continuity. Priests ruled through certainty. Civilizations survived by repeating stories that held them together. A monument with an unknown origin is powerful, but a monument that raises unanswered questions is destabilizing. So questions narrowed, not erased, but redirected. Instead of why is this built this way, the question became how does this fit our beliefs? Instead of what knowledge does this preserve, the question became which God does this honor? And over time, the deeper questions were no longer encouraged. Not forbidden, simply unnecessary. Because once a structure is absorbed into ritual, its original function no longer matters. This may explain something subtle. The Egyptians were not ignorant. They were selective. They explored what aligned with their worldview and left the rest untouched. Not because they lacked curiosity, but because curiosity has consequences. Opening sealed spaces can expose ignorance. Admitting uncertainty can weaken authority. So the safest path was reverence without inquiry. And this pattern is not ancient. It repeats everywhere. Whenever a system becomes stable, it resists questions that suggest its foundations were inherited, not created. Because inheritance implies dependency. It implies that greatness came from somewhere else. And no civilization likes to see itself as a caretaker instead of an origin. So the pyramids remained, silent, untouched, explained, but never fully examined. And the questions that once surrounded them did not disappear. They simply waited. Because questions are patient. They do not demand answers immediately. They wait for a time when curiosity becomes safe again. And that time may not belong to the past. It may belong to us. The time when curiosity returns. There are periods in history when curiosity becomes possible again. Not because answers are easy, but because uncertainty is no longer dangerous. Technology changes this. So does distance. When a civilization feels secure enough, it can afford to ask questions that earlier generations avoided. And we live in such a moment. For the first time, we are not bound to monuments as sources of authority or identity. We do not need the pyramids to legitimize kings, gods, or empires. We are free to see them as they are. And that freedom changes the kind of questions we ask. We no longer approach Gaza as worshippers or inheritors seeking meaning. We approach it as observers, with instruments, with measurements, with curiosity that does not require certainty. That is why the questions have returned. Why this geometry? Why these alignments? Why this precision? Here and nowhere else? Why does the greatest pyramid appear first? Why does no later structure improve upon it? Why do its internal spaces feel designed rather than ceremonial? These are not hostile questions. They are natural ones. And they only become possible once enough time has passed that asking them no longer threatens belief. In this sense, the pyramids may have succeeded exactly as intended. They waited, not for a specific culture, not for a specific language, but for a level of understanding, a moment when humans could look at stone and see information, when we could recognize that geometry is not decoration, that alignment is not coincidence, that silence can be intentional. If the builders expected memory to fail, they would not have relied on explanation. They would have relied on rediscovery, on the idea that one day someone would ask the right questions again. And perhaps that day is not in the future. Perhaps it is now, because curiosity has returned, not as rebellion, but as readiness. And when curiosity returns, inheritance becomes investigation. Stone becomes data, and the past becomes active again. A reading what was never written. And when curiosity returns, the next challenge is learning how to look, because the pyramids do not speak in sentences. They do not explain themselves. They do not guide the observer. They simply exist. And that forces a different kind of reading. You cannot approach them the way you approach a text. You approach them the way you approach a system, by measuring, by comparing, by noticing what repeats and what never does. This is where many interpretations fail. They look for meaning where meaning was never placed. They search for symbols when the structure speaks in relationships. Length to height, angle to horizon, stone to star. Nothing is labeled. Everything is proportional. This suggests intention without instruction, a message designed not to tell, but to be discovered. Consider how mathematics works. A theorem does not explain itself. It waits until the reader understands the rules well enough to see what is already there. The pyramids behave the same way. Their alignments only matter once you know how the sky moves. Their proportions only matter once you know what those ratios represent. Until then, they appear mute, which raises a precise and unsettling idea. What if the pyramids were never meant to be understood immediately? What if they were meant to wait for a certain level of knowledge? That would explain the absence of instructions. You do not include instructions if the message would be meaningless to its first readers. You include structure. You include consistency. You include patterns that only reveal themselves when the observer is ready. This is not how tombs are built. Tombs assume immediate understanding. This is how long-term archives are designed, not to teach the present, but to survive it. And when viewed this way, the pyramids stop feeling ancient and start feeling patient, as if they expected misinterpretation, as if misunderstanding was part of the design. They would be called tombs. They would be claimed by religions. They would be absorbed into myth, and still they would wait. Because eventually someone would stop asking, what do they say, and start asking, how do they behave? That shift from narrative to observation may be the key that was always required. And once you begin reading the pyramids this way, a final realization emerges. You are not uncovering a story. You are entering a conversation that was never interrupted, only paused. The test we didn't know we were taking. If the pyramids are a conversation, then they are not asking for belief. They are asking for capability. This is the part we rarely consider. A true archive does not reveal itself to everyone who encounters it. It reveals itself only to those who have learned how to read it. In that sense, the pyramids may function less like monuments and more like a test. Not a test of faith, not a test of obedience, a test of perception. Can you see structure without story? Can you notice precision without assigning intention too quickly? Can you accept uncertainty long enough to let patterns emerge on their own? Most civilizations could not. They needed meaning immediately. They needed gods, names, purposes, so they filled the silence. But filling the silence ends the conversation. The builders may have understood this. If they expected memory to fail, they would also expect misunderstanding. They would expect myths to grow around the structure. They would expect later cultures to project their own identities onto it, and they would design the structure so that none of that mattered. Because projection does not change geometry. Belief does not alter alignment. Stories do not distort ratios. Only measurement reveals what was placed there. So the pyramids wait for a specific moment in history, not defined by culture, but by method. A time when humans learn to slow down explanation and speed up observation. A time when curiosity becomes disciplined. And here is the uncomfortable part. We like to believe we are finally ready. We have satellites, lasers, scanners, computational models. But technology alone is not readiness. Readiness is restraint. It is the ability to say, I don't know yet, and that's acceptable. The pyramids may not be testing whether we are intelligent. They may be testing whether we are patient, whether we can resist closing the question with the first explanation that feels comfortable. Because once the question is closed, nothing new can be seen. And perhaps that is why the pyramids have never revealed themselves fully. Not because they are hiding, but because we keep answering too quickly. The test is still ongoing, and the stones are still watching. The moment the question turns back on us. At some point, every long investigation changes direction. The object you are studying stops being the center of the question, and you become it. If the pyramids are a test, then the test is not about the past. It is about us, about how we handle uncertainty, about how quickly we rush to name things, about whether we seek understanding or closure. Because the easiest way to misunderstand the pyramids is not to believe the wrong explanation. It is to believe any explanation too soon. The builders may have anticipated this. They may have known that future civilizations would be tempted to reduce complexity into story, that we would say tomb, symbol, ritual, myth. Because these words feel safe, they make the unknown manageable. But once a structure is labeled, it stops being questioned. And questioning is the only way a silent object can speak. So perhaps the pyramids were never meant to challenge our knowledge of history. Perhaps they were meant to challenge our relationship with knowledge itself. Do we seek answers, or do we seek certainty? Do we explore, or do we conclude? The pyramids do not reward confidence. They reward humility. They do not respond to authority. They respond to attention. They reveal nothing to those who arrive already convinced, and they reveal everything, slowly, to those willing to sit with not knowing. This is why the pyramids still feel unresolved. Not because we lack data, but because we resist ambiguity. We want the past to be settled so the present feels stable. Yet the builders may have understood something we are only beginning to rediscover. That uncertainty is not a flaw in understanding. It is the doorway to it. And if that is true, then the pyramids are not unfinished puzzles. They are mirrors. They reflect the mindset of the observer. To some, they are tombs. To others, symbols. To others, machines. But beneath all interpretations, they remain what they have always been. A question that does not demand an answer, only attention. And perhaps that is the final inheritance. Not knowledge, but the ability to keep asking. Charge what was left behind. The pyramids are still there, not because they were protected, not because they were explained correctly, but because they did not depend on explanation at all. They survived kings, they survived religions, they survived languages, borders, empires, and memory itself. And now they survive us, watching how we approach them. Perhaps this was always the point, not to deliver a final answer, not to prove a forgotten theory, not to announce a lost civilization, but to observe the ones that come after, to see whether we rush to certainty or stay with the question, to see whether we treat silence as absence or as intention. If the pyramids were inherited, then what truly passed from one age to the next was not stone. It was a choice. The choice to preserve without understanding. The choice to honor without control. The choice to leave something unfinished so that the future would have to think. And now that future is here, not because we solved the mystery, but because we finally stopped trying to close it. The pyramids do not ask us to believe anything. They ask us to notice, to slow down, to measure carefully, to question gently, and to remember that history is not a straight line, but a conversation across time, one that pauses, one that resumes, one that waits. Tonight the stones are quiet. The sky turns slowly above them, just as it always has. And somewhere between the geometry and the silence, between what was built and what was forgotten, a thought remains. What if the greatest inheritance was not knowledge at all, but the invitation to keep looking? Rest with that question. There is no need to answer it now. The pyramids have waited long enough.